Hey y'all, I'm Angela, and today I'm going to be doing my reading wrap-up for February. This month was kind of a rough month from a reading perspective. I read 10 books last month, I read 5 books this month, but 2 of those I finished on Leap Day. I think I went through a period of about 2 weeks where I read nothing, and 3 of those 5 books were rereads. So it was a little bit of a struggle. Part of, I think, what went wrong was that I was doing a lot of sort of social reading. A couple of the books that I tried and failed were for like book clubs, and then there were a couple of books that I was trying to read because other people were into. So I sort of shifted midway through the month and started trying to actually read things that were more likely to be a good fit for me personally. The other thing I think I'm going to do, at least for a few months going forward, is not try and read any more YA speculative fiction, so science fiction and fantasy, just because I consistently have not enjoyed it, including books that other people really love, including books by authors that I absolutely adore their adult stuff. Yeah, I think we're gonna back off of the YA spec fic train for a bit, because it just does not seem to really be vibing with me in my current state. The first book that I read this month was The Goblin Emperor by Kate Addison, which was a reread. It's actually, according to Goodreads, the 4th time I've read this book in 2 years. I really, really love this book. It is gorgeous and perfect, and it's very much up my alley. But it tells the story of Maya, who is the half-goblin son of the Elvish emperor, and when his father and older brothers are killed in an airship crash, he becomes emperor, so he goes from a life of obscurity and exile to being the emperor of quite a large land. It's very much a court drama. A lot of it takes place within a few rooms. There's often a lot of scenes where there's like 2 people doing paperwork, which was something that I had been waiting for in a book. That might not be something that you're looking for in a book, but I absolutely adore this book. It's also just really sweet and hopeful, mostly because Maya is such a kind and gentle person. That is something that I really enjoyed and continue to love. I also first read this book when I was in grad school. It really spoke to this experience of being sort of a adult emerging into a career for the first time. Maya spends a lot of time very overwhelmed and very much in this space where he can sort of like see what he should be doing, but he's not able to do that yet. And I think that as someone who is at the time entering into my career in student teaching and things, that really, really resonated. So some of it is that this is a book that I read at the right time, but I think that it is a great fit if that is a place that you are also in. And yeah, I just love this book. The second book that I read this month is Shades of Milk and Honey by Robinette. This is technically also a reread. I read it in 2013, but I remembered basically nothing that happened, so it's sort of like I was reading it fresh. I went into this book because it was Robinette's debut novel, and I feel like in my writing I've been in a place recently where I sort of am actively intimidating myself by only reading books that I'm just very intimidated by because I like them so much, and then feeling very much like that's not a place that I could achieve. Like, obviously I'm not there yet, but also that I just couldn't achieve. So I wanted to go back and read a novel that I remembered enjoying but not being blown away by, that is also a novel by like a very successful writer who I really respect and admire, both as like a writer and then also as an educator. So that was sort of some of my goal with rereading Shades of Milk and Honey. Shades of Milk and Honey is the first of, I don't know what the series is called, but it's her Jane Austen with magic books. So basically there is it's like Regency England and lots of like social stuff happening, but then on top of that there is a system of magic called glamour that is mostly artistic, so it's a lot of like visual and illusion magic, and our protagonist Jane is very good at it, and she's also older. She's like 28 and still unmarried, and so it's a Regency romance novel, and I definitely enjoyed it. Robinette has talked about sort of structural flaws in it that I did definitely agree with her assessment on. She actually, when she published the UK version of this, she made changes to it because it was, again, her first book, and so she'd learned so much, and her editor was like, would you like to change things? And she said yes. So I was trying to find the UK version so I could like read that one instead, but it proved difficult, so eventually I gave up and just read my mom's copy instead. But it's definitely a fun book. It's a relatively quick read. If you are interested in sort of the historical fantasy, or I guess in some cases historical science fiction space, and you haven't checked out Mary Robinette Kowal yet, it's probably worth a try. I do still enjoy this book, even if I definitely felt like some of the structural issues in the book. But overall, I really enjoyed it. I definitely am appreciating like reading more of her early work, and I think it was a good experience overall. The third book that I read this month was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuinston, which is that romance novel that has been literally everywhere. I mean, I guess this was a year or two ago because I'm slow, but that was everywhere. That is a love story between the first son of the President of the United States and one of the princes of England. So Alex, who's the son of the president, and Henry, the Prince of England, have sort of had this rivalry, and then they fall in love, and various things happen. And this is a very hyped book, talked about a lot. There were a couple of things going in that I did not know that I feel like I should have known, so I'm going to mention those first. The first one is that while it's not really a category in traditional publishing, this book has been often framed as YA, at least when I've encountered it, and it's definitely not. It's definitely new adult. Our characters are in their 20s. There are sex scenes in this book, and those were not things that I knew going in. That's not a critique of the book at all, right? But that is the experience that I have had in sort of the talking about it. Also, I went into this book thinking that it was between like two gay boys, because that is sort of what I had been told, and our protagonist Alex is definitely bisexual, very bisexual, 100% bisexual. I went into this book kind of nervous because I am a very pedantic and nitpicky person, and there was a lot of politics, and Alex, our protagonist, is from my hometown of Austin, and I was just nervous that there were going to be like a lot of little things that were going to be wrong that were going to bother me, and for the most part that didn't happen. There were like a couple of things that I was like, oh, I don't think that would happen, but nothing that really drew me out of the story. Overall, I enjoyed it. It was fun. I liked their relationship. It's definitely a political fantasy as much as it's like a romantic fantasy, and I would say that by the end they've spent basically as much time talking about sort of like the political landscape in Britain, and particularly the election in the United States, because Alex's mom is running for re-election, as they have on the actual relationship itself. Sort of, I'd say the beginning and the end are more politics heavy, and that is tied into their relationship as well, but some of it is also sort of independent of it. Mileage will probably vary on how much that is a thing that you are into. The realism there varied as well. I will say that I felt like the American representation, and particularly the Texas stuff, was much better than the British stuff in terms of accuracy. So again, mileage may vary, but I very much enjoyed it. I actually ended up really liking the Texas part. There's a sort of bittersweetness that I think comes from growing up as like a politically active, more liberal person in Texas, and this book really spoke to that. Also, Alex's older sister's Secret Service name is Bluebonnet, which I am here for. It was great. That is the Secret Service name that I would also want. Overall, I had fun with this book, even if it did have some sort of flaws, and I'm glad that I picked it up. The next book that I read was Lagoon by Nnedi Okoraphor. This is a first contact story set in Lagos, Nigeria, and basically aliens walk out of the ocean and say that they want to live on Earth, and that the place that they have chosen specifically is Lagos. There were a lot of things about this book that I really enjoyed. It's very fast-paced, it's very cinematic, which makes sense because part of what Okoraphor was doing was sort of responding to District 9, which had a lot of really stereotypical depictions of Nigerians, which she found understandably very frustrating. So part of what happened was she was like, what would this look like actually in Nigerian with Nigerians? And there are a huge number of different perspectives that happen. We're sort of following three main characters that are sort of chosen to be people interfacing with this alien species, but there's a whole bunch of other people as well. We switch sort of points of view and all kinds of things. There's some chapters that are like literally just a paragraph or so. And in some ways that was really cool and really worked. In some ways it jumped around maybe a little bit too much for me personally. It shifts in terms of like rules of the world and genre a little bit. So at times it's very science fiction-y, at times it's sort of very folklore-y. There's a lot of different rules and magic systems and things happening in ways that for me and for some other people I know has been a little bit jarring, but overall it was still a fun read. The book as a whole touched on a whole bunch of things, and I would have liked either it to touch on less or to be like longer and go deeper into those things. More than anything, it made me interested in checking out Okoraphor's other work, because I really did love the African science fiction space, which wasn't one that I had really seen before. I loved the idea of aliens like choosing particularly a particular place and having that place be in Africa as well. Neither of those are really concepts that I have seen before and I thought were really interesting and worked really well. The last book that I read or listened to this month was Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which again, technically a re-listen. I listened to it for the first time, I think in 2016, and I really loved it. Again, it is the telling of the story of Thomas Cromwell, who was a lawyer in England during Henry VIII's rule, and he rose to prominence in Henry VIII's court, which was not a thing that was done at that time for common folk to have the power and influence that Cromwell eventually gained. This first book, because it's ultimately a trilogy, the last book comes out in a couple of days now. This first book follows sort of the time when Anne Boleyn is coming to power, so Henry divorcing his first wife Catherine and bringing in Anne and the birth of Queen Elizabeth, so sort of that time period. And this is the kind of thing, like a retelling of a particular person, that I'm generally very skeptical of, because it feels somewhat dishonest to me to be like, here are all of the thoughts and experiences of this person that was an actual human person, but it's done so well here that it honestly hasn't bothered me. Mantel's depiction of Cromwell is quite generous. Cromwell's often shown as sort of a villain of this story, but her Cromwell is really gentle and competent, as well as being like, in some ways, a ruthless enabler, right? This is a very violent time. This is like a very powerful space, but I really enjoy her depiction of Cromwell. I really like the world, and it's all just very thoughtfully done. The role of the Protestant Reformation, I feel like, is so well handled. There's very much this sense as England separates from the Catholic Church of the economic and the political impetus for doing so, but also there's like a real theological undertone that works very well. Particularly Cromwell is someone that is also like has illegally translated copies of the Bible in his house and is like wrestling with these questions of faith and theology as well, and I think that complements really well. It's also very much a book that is about the perception of various things, and particularly of Cromwell, who is seen by many people in the book as this very scary figure, and certainly that has been the case throughout history as well. I think that the conversation around this idea of like, how do we tell these stories of people that have lived before is really interesting. There was one quote that I wanted to read really quickly that comes from that is on my laptop because, again, I listened to the audiobook. But, so it's Cromwell talking about this idea that the living are haunted by the dead and how that's not really the case. He knows different now. It's the living that chase the dead. The long bones and skulls are tumbled from their shrouds, and words like stones thrust into their rattling mouths. We edit their writings. We rewrite their lives. Which is just really beautiful, and also I think speaks to this project of telling the story of someone that has come before, which, as I mentioned, I'm skeptical of. I just feel like it does such a good job in such a thoughtful and nuanced way, and I'm really excited for the last book. I'm also really nervous because it ends poorly for Cromwell, but it was a really nice sort of ending to the month for me. What began as sort of a rough month, but ultimately I enjoyed all of the books that I read, and I feel like I got a lot out of all 5 of them, and some of the other books that I attempted as well. But that is it for me. If you read any great books in February, please let me know down in the comments, and happy reading, everybody.